Hi class, we're going to talk today about an unsettled world. Again, we're talking about the late 1800s up to 1914 and what's making the world so unsettled. Let's take a look at that. There's going to be a lot of factors that lead us into global instability at the end of the 1900s up to World War I. Some of those things are going to be population movements. There's going to be a financial crisis in certain areas. There'll be class conflict, the rise of the women's movement, if you will, and more than anything else, this hatred of colonial domination, this imperialization attempts by the world, stronger powers over the weaker ones, and there's going to be a lot of conflict come out of these regions. So all of these things coming together along with rivalries within Europe, combined with growing protests, are going to undermine the European and American positions in world affairs. There is some new scientific thinking and artistic expressions known as cultural modernism that will take place, and it's going to challenge this Western view of progress and open up Europe and North America to cultural achievements of non-Western society. So we're going to talk about a few movements and what's happening in the world during this time. First up, immigration. There is so much movement of people in the world, class. There's going to be immigration of Europeans to the United States, also to places like Argentina and other parts of the world. So there's going to be a lot of movement. The high tide and the high point of immigration into the United States is going to be between 1900 and 1910. 6 million people come here. Now this immigration and internal migration is going to exist as well. We're going to see people like millions of South Asians are going to be recruited, if you want to call it that, to labor on plantations, railways, mines in the Caribbean, the Dutch East Indies, and East Africa and the like. But we're going to see nearly 1 million Chinese immigrate to population pressures that's occurring there, so they're pushed out because they have a shortage of land, and there's also social turmoil in China that we're going to talk about in a minute. And they're going to come to the Americas. They're going to go to places like Hawaii, the West Indies, and the like. And this industrialism is pushing millions to even migrate within their own countries, from the countryside and into the city. So we're going to see an urban population explosion. Now, until about 1914, until World War I, there's going to be few restrictions of migrations and immigrations in the world. Travel within Europe doesn't require passports or work permits or anything like that. But the United States is going to create an act that's going to sort of set a precedent, and it will follow along the way. For example, the United States Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, formerly the Immigration Act of 1882. What this does is a federal law that was the first and only major federal legislation to explicitly suspend immigration on a specific nationality. The basic exclusion law prohibited Chinese laborers from entering the country, and subsequent amendments to the law prevented Chinese laborers who had left the United States from even returning. So this passage of the act is going to represent the outcome of years of racial hostility against the Chinese and an anti-immigrant agitation by white Americans. It's going to set the precedent for later restrictions that we will set in the United States against immigration of other nationalities, and it's going to start an era in which the United States changed from a country that welcomed almost all immigrants to a gatekeeping one. And the gatekeeping will be done at Ellis Island on the Atlantic coast and Angel Island on the Pacific coast. Here's a propaganda piece at the time. We must draw the line somewhere, so they're validating this Chinese Exclusion Act. Class, world population is growing everywhere you look, and that's going to lead to urbanization explosion. So, between 17 and 1900, the population of the world will rise from 725 million in 1700 to 1.65 billion in 1900. Now, this is a photograph from London in 1910. Class, these cities, these urban environments are going to boom, leading to we need some city planning, right? How are we going to pack all these people into one small place? We're going to see mixed results. The United States has a lot of problems. You could read Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives. Governments, however, they saw the need, and finally, because of tragedies and the like, and they began to invest in things like opera houses and libraries and sewage systems. We need sewage systems, parks, green space. So that's going to take place. The goal was to ward off, things like disease and bring crime down. And let's impress the world with our modernity, okay? So the goals were somewhat successful. Nonetheless, cholera, tuberculosis, diseases will be major killers of people during this time. Listen, Birmingham, Alabama, we nearly didn't survive a cholera outbreak about 3 years after we incorporated in 1871. We almost didn't make it. Suicide, class, alcoholism, it's a growing problem, so all is not well within our urban settings, and that will play out over and over. All right, I mentioned to you imperialism is one of the major components of the unsettled world during this time. This is a major source of discontent, is imperialization and colonization. All this unrest that emerges in Africa, remember the scramble for Africa, it did have some Europeans asking, why would Africa resist the awesome benefits of becoming civilized? So people started asking questions and looking at this. One place that we're going to see the unsettled world explode and play out is going to be in South Africa. And this is the time about 1899 to 1902 when the South African Anglo-Boer War takes place. It was actually 2 wars. But what's going to happen is it will pit the British settlers of Cape and Natal regions against the Afrikaners, the descendants of Dutch settlers of the Transvaal and Orange Free State. So it's going to pit British settlers who have come into South Africa against the descendants of Dutch settlers that were already there. So it is white on white. However, there's millions of South African native people who live there. So it's going to involve 4 million black inhabitants and about 1 million whites. Now, what led to this war? The discovery of gold and diamonds in the Transvaal region in the mid-1880s is going to really concern the British. They're going to pour into the region. They're concerned that the Afrikaners are going to become a powerhouse in South Africa, and they can't have that. Previously, diamonds, just so you'll know, were mined in India. But by the late 1800s, 95% of the world's diamonds are going to be mined in Africa. The De Beers Company, remember Mr. Cecil Rhodes that I've mentioned to you before, they're going to take control, the British De Beers will take control of diamond mining by 1920, and they still have it. They have been accused of much misdoing. You can research that on your own, but you can watch a movie called Blood Diamonds with Leonardo DiCaprio for the Hollywood version of the violent, bloody diamond industry. Now, the Transvaal president launched the preemptive strike against British. That was not good. It started a war that's going to last 3 years. And what we found out in this war is something that is going to lead to some unintended consequences. The British are going to introduce a terrifying institution concentration camps. Oh, we've never seen this before. They're going to try to combat the successful Afrikaners' successful guerrilla warfare. They were fighting. They weren't fighting in formation. They were successfully fighting the British and winning. But what the British did, they set up these concentration camps. Okay, the men are going to go off fighting, but we're going to pull in their wives and their children and their parents, and we're going to put them in concentration camps, and people died of starvation and disease. It was horrific. So I guess you could say the British won, if you want to call it that. The Transvaal and Orange Free State will fall under British control. And class, this will ultimately lead us to apartheid, which is segregation for blacks, similar to our Jim Crow laws in the United States. So this took place shortly after that. So it was a terrible set of unintended consequences of this war. The horrors of the Boer Wars traumatized British and really all of those involved. It really shook the world. There was a lot of things written about this war, and the prestige of the British suffered during this time. Hey, these guys are brutal, and so it put a new spin on the British civilization, right? And here's some pictures of Boer guerrillas. They were some bad guys, bad fighting guys. And a couple of other pictures of the war. Other struggles are taking place in Africa. So let's talk a little bit about this. First of all, the Herero, the San, and the Muslim Arab peoples are going to rebel against German rule. So Germany had gotten into the scramble for Africa. German commanders in German Southwest Africa issued an extermination order against the Herero population. This is important. This leads to the first genocide of the 20th century. Class, over 100,000 people were dead, and for what? The Maji revolt started over the Germans forcing them to grow and work in cotton farms. This is modern-day Tanzania, and it's going to lead to 10,000 dead. However, these horrible things did arouse public revulsion in the Western world. What are we doing? And so there was people that started speaking out against this imperialization attempts. Those favoring imperialism viewed it, well, these are just exceptions to the rule. Others thought maybe we haven't done enough to bring about civilization. So unfortunately, this led to increased number of officials being stationed in these colonies and continued oppression all the way around. Let's talk for a minute about the Qing dynasty in China and what's happening in China. There's a lot of problems here. There's a lot of people who are not able to own land. There's widespread poverty. There's peasant discontent, and it's going to lead the Qing dynasty in China vulnerable to internal revolts and, more importantly, foreign intervention. So the dynastic Qing dynasty authority starts breaking down because of foreign pressures. First China's defeat was in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 1895, humiliating. Japan's now occupying parts of China. Remember, I said Japan's on this militarization, imperialization reign, as was Great Britain. They're going to occupy parts of China. They're going to acquire Taiwan as a colony. They're going to also invade Korea. Just horrific what happens there. European powers are going to put pressure on China to have spheres of influence within China. The United States proposes an open door policy. We want our Christian missionaries in, and then we want to do trade with you. It really led to major unrest and revolts. Now, the most violent reaction during this time was called the Boxer Uprising. And it started with the peasants against foreign influence. Because listen, class, by 1900, Christian missionaries and businessmen were in China mainland. And they felt, the commoner, the peasants, the local people felt they were being targeted, where proselytizing was going on. Laborers were being forced, to work in American companies, European companies, and the locals felt that they were being undermined of their cultural and religious heritage. So there's going to be a major uprising take place. Groups like the Red Lanterns, these are so interesting, that's why I brought them up. Mostly young and unmarried women wearing red garments are going to participate in the Boxer movements like many others, but the Red Lanterns believed they possessed magical power, so they were interesting. The Qing court, under the leadership of Empress Cixi, vacillated over feeling threatened by the Boxers and embracing them as a check on the foreign intrusion, right? We don't really like the foreigners there, but we're sort of concerned about the Boxer Rebellion. We're sort of, concerned about all these peasants uprising. So eventually they're going to side with the Boxers, and that's going to lead to disastrous results for them. In the Boxer Rebellion, Christians were attacked, foreign people were attacked. It will take a foreign army of 20,000 to come in and defeat the Boxer uprising that had been killing Christians and destroying railroad tracks and telegraph lines and taking over foreign embassies and companies. So we've got to protect our interests there, so they're going to send in a foreign army. This army is mostly made up of soldiers from Japan, Russia, Britain, Germany, France, U.S., but the rebellion revealed some things. These foreign troops coming into China to put down the uprising and protect their interests and missionaries saw that China could be an imperialistic opportunity where they can gain some power. So this will undermine the Qing dynasty's capabilities of effectively ruling China. So it'll create a political vacuum class, and this will lead to some disastrous long-term consequences depending on who you ask, as you'll see play out later on in China. The Empress Cixi emerged as a powerful figure in the Qing court from the 1860s until she died in 1908. Here she's shown surrounded by her court eunuchs. Early, Qing rulers had developed sort of a eunuch power in court affairs. So I thought you would find this picture interesting. And this is just a map of where the foreign spheres of influence exist in China after the Boxer Rebellion. So I'm going to conclude with this, class. Let's take a minute and look at the woman question. Listen, female activists are standing up and demanding more and more rights as citizens as we work our way into the 20th century. Radical voices are demanding fundamental changes to family and the larger society. Debates over the role of imperialism and colonial rule on women in Africa and Asia will emerge. And this idea of separate spheres of influence, between men and women is going to be challenged. Listen, economic developments had created new jobs for women and had created access to education somewhat. So we do have an increase in more and more opportunities. But women will become involved in public reform movements, waves of this in the United States and Europe. We have the club movement. We have the church as a springboard for women activists. This is going to take place in, Europe, France, Great Britain, places like that. Much of the population, though, by and large, did not support higher education or public activism for women. But many women began to assert control over things like their reproductive rights. Contraceptives were illegal in many countries, yet women had methods to limit the number of children and began doing so. Some married late, some didn't marry. Class abortions been around from the beginning of time. But this successful contraception tended to be more effective as education levels increased. We had some great reform workers in the United States. Margaret Sanger is one. You should do a little research on Margaret Sanger, who changed life for women at the turn of the century. Birth rate in America by 1900 was half of what it was the century before. So there was a really big push for women's suffrage. It's going to have limited success early on. We do see New Zealand, Australia, Finland, Norway, they will all give women the right to vote by 1913. But what about the United States, class? When do women earn the right to vote here? That's going to be 1920. Now, male alarmists portrayed women's suffrage rights as a beginning of the end of civilization as we know it. But female views, they're going to vary throughout the middle-class European and American women. They're not really seeking gender equality, but they want something else. Women's roles in the colonies under colonization is something that is not good. But there was this debate. The argument was colonialization in attempts in Africa and places like that, in India, they say benefited women. Because, listen, we have a decline of veiling, we have a decline of foot binding, we have a decline of widow burning, sati, and we have a decline in female genital mutilation. So these are justifications that colonial intervention was good. Yet, class, all of those still exist to some degree. But in a bigger reality, colonialism often added to women's burdens in the colonized regions. Male workers were drawn into labor of export economy, industrialization. So agricultural work fell exclusively to women. For example, in Africa, the growth of mining and large estate production meant that men were often gone for much of the year. European missionaries preached messages of domesticity and limited numbers of women enrolled in schools. Customary colonial laws did not protect women. Instituted by colonial officials, it favored men over women. Women often lost their property and other rights that they enjoyed before European colonization. So women, today, class, it is better in some parts of the world, but they're still fighting for equality, even in places like the United States. Think about this. In Saudi Arabia, women could drive for the very first time just this year. So a long way to go. As usual, class, keep in touch.